On the 29th of November 1931, at the meeting of the Samuel Johnson Society at Pembroke College, Oxford, at 9 p.m., J.R.R. Tolkien gave a talk to students and guests called A Secret Vice. During our research for the newly published HarperCollins edition of A Secret Vice, Tolkien on Language Invention, which is, there's a flyer about in the hallway if you wanted to know more about that, Dr. Dimitra Feeney and myself, after many months of searching the records of various Oxford literary and philological societies, tracked down the actual minutes in the Pembroke College archives of this meeting, which gives a first-hand account of what Tolkien spoke about that November 9th. Ooh, that doesn't look very good, does it? What's happening to my... That looks kind of weird, doesn't it? Oh well, there's something wrong with the PowerPoint slide, but I can just read it out. Gives a first-hand account of what Tolkien spoke about that November 9th. Is there a problem with that?
Where's the sound going to be in this?
No.
What's the problem?
Well, that's... We're only getting half the slide for some reason. Sorry.
Okay. I'll see if I can fix it.
Okay, let me just keep reading because we're filming. Okay. One of the most striking parts of this report is Tolkien's mention of a curious language spoken in the Isle of Fondway. And what the minute says is Professor Tolkien went on to discuss those languages which were composed of words entirely their own, whether derived phonetically or from some other probably dead language. The most interesting example of the phonetic type of language is those spoken on the island in Fondway, which apparently has no connection whatsoever with any other known language, nor is it spoken or understood anywhere elsewhere than in this one small island. The minutes are referring to that part of Tolkien's Secret Vice talk, which can be found in the Secret Vice papers held at the Bodleian Library, MS Tolkien 24. For whatever reason, these pages were not included by Christopher Tolkien in the original published version of the talk in the 1983 volume, The Monsters and the Critics and Other Essays. However, the placement of these papers in the folio indicated to us that these papers were part of the original Tolkien talk gave, and not a separate note he wrote before or after the talk, as other papers in the portfolio clearly are. Our assumption was proven by the newly found minutes of the Samuel Johnson Society meeting. In this paper, I want to briefly explore the details of this unique Fondwegian language. I would suggest that Tolkien's curious evocation of it served two purposes. First, it was Tolkien's way of paying homage to past language inventors, early practitioners of Tolkien's Secret Vice. And secondly, it was an interesting and slightly ludic way for Tolkien to present an example of an invented language which characterized what he had come to believe through his own work on invented languages all art languages should have. First, the language itself, as it is fairly new to Tolkien's scholarship. Tolkien's introduction of it is quite curious, given the pattern and pace of the talk he was delivering that night. After some false starts, Tolkien launches into the main subject of his paper, quote, the construction of imaginary languages in full or outline for amusement. He makes the point that given the nature of this art or game, it is usually practiced in private, hence a secret vice. But in one statement that we have restored to the talk, it not appearing in the 1983 edition, Tolkien indicates, quote, I give no names. I have made small efforts of research. I use as evidence merely some of the material that sheer chance has brought my way. I give no names. An intriguing statement by Tolkien, which I shall return to. After this, Tolkien launches into a fairly autobiographical review of his early experience with language invention, taking his readers through his early experience with Animalic, his own participation in Nebbosh, and then giving details of his first privately invented language of Nafrin. Tolkien characterizes Nafrin as still being influenced by, quote, learned languages, namely English, Latin, and Spanish, but also showing a, quote, nascent individual element. One of the key characteristics of this nascent element is the construction of a word that deliberately attempt in their invention to not reflect a direct or overt relation to a primary word language. In exploring this particular element further, Tolkien says that in attempting to invent individual names and words, quote, the absence of alien elements is not of first-class importance. Here Tolkien may be thinking about some examples of invented languages for fiction in which the creator tried to make the language look alien by just jumbling up a word, a series of consonants, so you couldn't really pronounce it. Rather, Tolkien suggests that a very alien word form could be constructed out of purely phonetic elements. We'll get to that. Since it is, quote, it is as much in habitual sequences, yeah. Oh, brilliant, we'll go there, that's fine. And combinations as in individual phonemes or sound units that a language or language may bear. And here Tolkien first wrote expresses its peculiarity, but crossed it out and wrote achieves individuality. He then gives a suggestion that this could be achieved by turning an English word, in this case the word scratch, backwards phonetically, stairs, making the point, quote, each phenome being perfectly native, that is from English, but the total, the new word form, entirely foreign. This is where the new Funwegian language comes in, and the talk, and indeed, it is in this part of the explanation of this attempt to deliberately make an invented language achieve this sense of being individual. Now, from a textual perspective, Tolkien's own introduction of Funwegian is curious in several respects. First, Tolkien reports that he, quote, recently became possessed by accident of some secret documents, a grammar and glossary, and some sentences spoken in the Funwegian language, spoken apparently in the Isle of Fonway. Could Tolkien's, quote, find be part of his earlier statement that, quote, I use as evidence merely some of the material that sheer chance has brought my way, with a parallel between possessed by accident and sheer chance in Tolkien's description of this material? Perhaps, and there's a debate out there right now about whether this is true or not. While doing my PhD thesis, where I first encountered these pages, and then again in prep for this book, we did fairly extensive research into where this language could have come from. I am fairly sure that what we are seeing here is Tolkien the mythmaker using a story to introduce Funwegian to his listeners. Tolkien is presenting this material as found by accident and is thus reporting what he found. Well, this type of framework was not new to Tolkien's way of telling a story. As we know, as far back as the Book of Lost Tales materials, Tolkien used the reported narrative framework of first Ariel and then Elfwine to hear, record, and transmit his own emerging mythology and the narrative framework, and others, which will remain a key part of Tolkien's mythopoeia. Moreover, Tolkien's use of the, quote, found manuscript topos was certainly not a new idea and had been used by early inventors of art languages, and suggests Tolkien paying homage to this tradition as well. In the 1871 Hollow Earth-inspired traveler's tale, The Coming Race, Edward Bullier Lytton's unnamed American traveler reports on the language of a subterranean creatures who spoke Vrilya, including a fairly comprehensive grammar and vocabulary, as well as the exploration of the development and decay of language inspired by the works of the philologist of the time, Max Müller, to whom Bullier-Lytton dedicated the book. In Percy Gregg's The Story of a Wrecked Record, the found document Topos includes a report of the language of Marshall, spoken on Mars, which Gregg uses to construct noun declensions and verb conjunctions, from which he developed several phrases, such as Zifu Zifel, Zifu Marni, Klafta Karithal, which means a child cries for the stars, a maiden for the matron's dress, a woman for her shroud. So why the changes from a straight autobiographical exploration of his growth as a language inventor to this one? I would suggest that the hint here may be in the statement Tolkien uses to introduce the material, quote, which will save this paper from being too autobiographical. Throughout his Secret Vice, Tolkien makes the point that he wishes he had more examples of other people's language invention to share. For example, when exploring Nevbosh, Tolkien states, quote, it is difficult to get evidence of higher stages, and then wrote in brackets, quote, this must be my excuse for becoming more and more autobiographical, regretfully and from no arrogance. I should much prefer the greater objectivity of studying other people's efforts. After taking this autobiographical approach with Animalik, Nevbosh, and Nafrin, perhaps Tolkien felt he needed to use the found manuscript topos idea to introduce his listeners to this next example of the language invention. So that's why. But where does Fonway and its language Funwegian come from? As we stated in the commentary to A Secret Vice, while Tolkien offers no note on what the name Fonway or Funwegian means, There are two possible avenues for further investigation, besides the obvious Norway and Norwegian, which we've looked at as well. First, the Fon phoneme may harken back to Tolkien's 1904 chiding rebus message to Father Francis Morgan, which contains the expression chi-fongi, dances, which is later defined as Frenchified prances, suggesting cheap French dances. So could Fon refer to an element of French, one of the learnt languages that Tolkien mentions in his notes for the Norwegian grammar? And thus Fonway was meant to have some unspecified relation to French. As Fonway is an island, another example of language invention that Tolkien may be slightly alluding or best paying homage to is the work published by an unknown author who published under the name George Salamanzar, who was actually a friend of Samuel Johnson, and so a possible link to the Johnson Society. He claimed to be from the island of Formosa, modern Taiwan, and published specimens of the Formosan language, which became a sensation, including creating a whole cottage industry in inscribed Formosan fans, until he was debunked by Sir Edmund Halley of the Common fame as a complete fabrication. Returning to the minutes of the meeting, it was reported that the Norwegian language was the most interesting example of languages which were, quote, composed of words entirely their own, which derived phonetically or from some other probably dead language. The minute picks up the several times Tolkien emphasized the individual sense of the Norwegian language. For example, when Tolkien states that the structure of the Norwegian grammar is dependent on learned languages like Latin and French, and here's an example of what the grammar Tolkien gives of the Norwegian language, which you can see when it comes to pronouns, I, you, he, she, it. It follows, it's different words, but it follows a kind of Indo-European structure. And here we have this mysterious con word, which is some noun, and it's declined, nominative, genitive, plural, etc. So it's following a pattern that's very much like you would see, for example, with Latin or a Romance language, basically. Tolkien specifically emphasizes the point about originality by first listing from his found glossary of 250 Norwegian words, which he may have read out as there is an instruction to do so, although we don't have the full list of these words, and one wonders if that would have taxed the patience of his listeners just a bit too much. He first starts out by pointing out Norwegian words that do suggest derivative origin from one of these learnt languages. And here's an example of some of those words, and you can see some of these words clearly have derivative origin from Latin, such as momor for death, act for end, both, epish for letter, epistle, etc., mosa for love, passe for peace, etc. But then he goes ahead and he starts talking about words that don't have any derivative origin. And we start to get into the, unfortunately, very few words Tolkien gives us in the Norwegian language itself. And one wishes he would have spent more time on the ones that were not less derivative, but the ones that were derivative, but the more original ones. And here you can see some of the examples of the words Tolkien gives. And these are all in the book, by the way, and with some explanation and everything. It is at this point that Tolkien lets his listeners in on the major past practitioner of, for him, a not-so-secret vice, who clearly inspired Tolkien's seeming invention of Norwegian, and may have been one of the key sources for the research of the talk that Tolkien was talking about. And that's with this quote, which you can't read, so I'll read it. The whole is slightly reminiscent, in fact, of the Swiftian characters, and as seen in scraps vouchsafed of the Lilliputian, Lufuscasdun, I can't pronounce that word to say in my knife, and Brobdingnian idioms. Indeed, I would suggest that this part of Tolkien's talk was in part an homage to, as well as a ludic intertextual interlude on one of the major, but not the first, inventors of elements of invented language for fictional works, Jonathan Swift. In his 1726 satiric work, Gulliver's Travels, Swift used invented names, places, and phrases with a different and unique sound sense to distinguish the various peoples that Gulliver related from his many shipwrecks on several islands, which each possess its own unique languages. These peoples, their cultures, and examples of language are communicated to the reader intertextually by the use of the traveler's tale framework. Tolkien characterizes Norwegian as, quote, a general Swiftian character pervades all the whole. Tolkien's interest in the phonetically variant names of words Swift invented is further shown in a separate note in the Secret Vice Papers, which is in the book, on which Tolkien made a list of names and phrases for Gulliver's first 3 voyages, which we've included in the new edition. These notes show Tolkien very interested in the phonetic sounds of the names and also how Swift used different phonetic elements to distinguish the different peoples that Gulliver encountered. So for example, he uses a lot of clusters like GL, GR, LG for names of the Brobdingian idioms, which is when Gulliver is very small. And then he changes that when he goes to another island and it becomes very big. So Swift is playing around with a very early form of what Tolkien, of course, would become very interested in, and that sound sense, the sound sense of words, without knowing necessarily what their meanings are. Tolkien thought Swift did well at this, but then he also immediately counters this by stating that, quote, one would not understand or be able unerringly to assign many words to pygmy or giant, indicating that Tolkien thought Swift did part of the job in his name invention of creating words with specific sound sense to distinguish the pygmy Lilliput from the giant Brobdingian. Indeed, in a later communication from 1937, Tolkien stated to his publishers that his own Elvish name invention was coherent and consistent because they were based upon 2 related linguistic formulae which achieves a reality and an illusion of historicity that was not fully achieved by other name inventors such as Swift and Dunsany, Lord Dunsany. Therefore, while Swift's name invention showed some signs of using sound sense to distinguish peoples, what it lacked in Tolkien's view was the morphological structure that lay behind Tolkien's Elvish names, constructed from base roots and attendant sound combination rooms that combine symbol, sound, and sense with structured morphology and grammar. What Tolkien characterized on one of the newly published notes in this volume as, quote, simplest form of game, decides on the sounding combinations, invent words according to rules. So in addition to evoking the work of past language inventors, early practitioners of the secret vice, like Swift, I would suggest Tolkien was also using his accidentally found Funwegian language to illustrate several key characteristics that by the time he gave this talk in November 1931, Tolkien felt were important elements of art languages, and which his own invention of his nexus of Elvish languages reflected. 1. First, that invented words in an art language should have a sense of fitness between symbol, the word form and its sound, and its sense or meaning, and this should be made up the nature of the language. This is reflected in Tolkien's focus on the sound nature of Funwegian, by characterizing it as original, quote, in both its phonetic evidence and its mechanism is peculiar and individual. What Tolkien's plan for this sound sense actually was cannot be clearly ascertained by the frustratingly few original Funwegian words that he gives. But they clearly do not reflect or look like any other words from Tolkien's pre- or Elvish languages to come. Indeed, in his review of the new edition of Secret Vice for the New Statesman, John Garth characterized this language as, quote, the most surprising thing about it coming from Tolkien is its ugliness. I'm wondering if a note Tolkien made on one of the Secret Vice manuscript pages may apply here. Quote, and even here the best results are achieved by making a language in which the sounds do mean something, though only perhaps to the author. 2, that the language should be underpinned by a system of grammar, of which we, unlike Nagbash and Nafrin, have fragments of for Funwegian, but no sentences as Tolkien reported finding in the Funwegian papers, which is quite interesting. For Tolkien, at heart a philologist, the construction of elaborate and ingenious grammars was a key element and passion of his language invention, as evidenced by the massive amount of grammars and language papers that the Elvish Linguistic Fellowship is still in the process of thankfully publishing. Finally, that language should be co-eval and co-commitment element of myth-making and world-building. And several times, of course, we have the very famous statement in On Fairy Stories, mythology is language and language is mythology, a mantra which Verlin Flieger has so eloquently contextualized as, quote, no modifiers, no explanations, just 7 words that convey Tolkien's bedrock belief about words and what they do. So as you can see, Tolkien's evocation of Funwegian in the Secret Vice Tour suggests more questions and avenues of research for Tolkien students and scholars, and we hope that this new edition, including the restoration of this section of talk of Tolkien's will encourage more exploration of the game or art that Tolkien unveiled on 29th November 1931, and would go on to influence and shape the art languages that would follow, from the tach-be, tach-bech of Hamlet in the original Klingon, to the hash-yer-doch-lech of Dothraki from Game of Thrones, and the many thousand practitioners of today's not-so-secret vice, including yours truly, a legacy that probably would have astounded Tolkien and may well have pleased him. Thank you. Colleagues from back to PowerPoint.
Thank you, Andrew. That was fascinating. I'm sure lots of people have got questions for you. Who'd like to start?
Oh, come on. Yes?
On the slide, one of the things that you didn't actually mention in the talk was the idea of the word form sounding aesthetically pleasing. And that to me seems a little opposite to the intent. I would focus more on the sense of fitness. If you look at something like Klingon or the Black Speech or Lovecraftian speech, it is speech intended to sound unpleasant because that is the goal, to give you a feeling of unpleasantness, that this is a brutal, violent, non-art-making people, that it is intentionally, aesthetically unpleasant for storytelling.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think sound symbolism is quite a complicated thing. I mean, what I always think about is the fact that without even knowing what the words mean,
Right.
For Western audiences, saying "Ailari lasi lanta soinin" sounds a lot more beautiful than "Ashnags debatical Ashnags gimbatul." I mean, and again, there's a real controversy about would that be the same in other cultures and other races. But for the cultures that Tolkien was working in, those long vowels, even without knowing what those words mean, you get a sense of what those people are like, as opposed to Ashnags debatical with all the consonant clusters and all that. So yeah, no, I take your point there. No, and sound symbolism is quite an interesting area. Yes.
Irina at the back.
Irina.
Yeah, sorry, can I just pick up on that last one? Because, and I actually have a question. And not the fact how we react to language, I think it's to do with intonation. Because examples, you just gave yourself, you used an intonation that made the second version just sound harsh. And give it to somebody who speaks Arabic,
Yeah.
and have the intonation in the way they would at the beginning of a love letter, and it would sound absolutely beautiful. So I think that's something that can't escape Tolkien.
Well, I think Tolkien was, for Tolkien, this was a very personal aesthetic. He says that over and over. It was what he responded to. So for Tolkien, very influenced by languages like Finnish, for example, he loved the phoneticness of Finnish, the sounds of it, and that's why the elves speak a language that have lots of commonality with Finnish, basically. And then I think when he was thinking of the Black Speech and the orcs, well, that had more of a consonant-y kind of sound to him, basically. But what I'm fascinated by is having someone who, from a completely different culture, read The Lord of the Rings and react to that ring inscription, for example.
So then the quick question, any kind of evidence that Tolkien had any interest in the Basque language? Because that, of course, is a language that is in a language family totally of its
Yes,
own.
totally non-Indo-European. Well, he was certainly interested in Spanish because of, early on with Father Francis Morgan. I don't know, and I'm sure there's lots of people in this room who will know, if there was any relation to, if he had it. Yes, David, I know you would know.
Well, I'll just say he obviously had at least a passing knowledge of Hungarian,
Yes.
and well, it was remotely related to Finnish. But the Ashnags Gulbaturuk does have resonances with Altaic languages like Hungarian, like Turkish, for example. Sorry.
Yeah, and he also invented a language.
And he's obviously acquainted, at least, with the three consonant system of the Semitic language.
Semitic. And Khazdul, of course,
Yes,
Dwarvish is
yes,
very...
yes.
But he also invented a fragment of a language called Magel, which was based very much on Hungarian, somewhere in the 40s and 50s, which was sort of... Yes? Dennis.
It was a comment on what it all depends on what we mean by aesthetically pleasing. for example, if your purpose is to talk about people like elves, what would be aesthetically pleasing would be a language that would correspond to who they are. But if you want a language that would be for orcs and trolls and maybe Tolkien would find black speech aesthetically pleasing for them because it would correspond to their nature.
Yeah.
So beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So if you portray nasty people, it will be aesthetically pleasing to make them speak that way. An orc that speaks beautiful Elvish would be jarring.
Yes, and I think in this discourse it's always important to remember that this
so the context. So it's in the interaction of these four notions, these four that in here we have 4 dimensions.
Yeah, and I think again in the context of his personal aesthetic is the important thing.
Yes.
These are what Tolkien is saying is important to our languages. Nelson.
Yeah, I mean, I think the context is important, but Tolkien also clearly, he says in English and Welsh is beautiful. And there's a certain relative, that's not in an artistic context. He's talking about engaging with a real primary world language that he finds has an aesthetic on its own right, not in its matching to some. I mean, there's a sort of contextual aspect to it to some extent, but he's in the first instance talking about the.
Just half a question.
From Dennis.
Yes,
Did you want
just a
to
tiny
follow
one.
Speaking several languages, I'm well aware, for example, how in each language, even natural languages that are that of people existing in this world, the notion of aesthetics still works for creating sounds that seem to fit and make sense, especially in the use of suffixes, prefixes and suffixes that would have a sort of what I call a phonesthetic dimension, which people would make, for example, would recognize a word as belonging to this category, even if it doesn't, even if you've never encountered it. And that's it's a sort of right brain perspective.
And that's how Tolkien built his languages, didn't he? It had base roots and things like that. Any other?
No, I think we must stop now.
Okay.
Yes, but they must catch Andrew afterwards. But Jessica's coming on in a
Jessica,
minute.
I would never absolutely never.
Right, big round of applause.